So, students, today's topic is development of oral cavity and face. We begin to study digestive system, and let's begin from the development of oral cavity and tissues and structures which are associated with oral cavity, which form our face. Here we can see the embryo. Embryo on this stage already has ectoderm, outer embryonic layer. It has endoderm, inner embryonic layer, and also between them we have mesoderm. And here we can see that endoderm, it forms tubule, it forms duct with blind ends, which have no communication with outer environment. But we have yolk duct which provides communication between endodermal tube and also yolk sac. And here we can see that primitive digestive tube, it has both blind ends which have no communication with outer environment. So how we will eat and how this embryo will release waste products into outer environment. On this stage, ectoderm is involved in the formation of the digestive system, and we can see here formation of two invaginations. On cranial end of the embryo, we call this stomodome, it's primitive embryonic oral cavity, and in the posterior end we have formation of proctodome. It's primitive embryonic anus. Later they are fused with primitive intestinal tube, endodermal tube, and here we can see oropharyngeal membrane. It will be place of the soft palate, place between oral cavity and pharynx. And here we have cloacal membrane, which separates endodermal and ectodermal parts of the rectum. And later those membranes, they are broken. Here we can see broken oropharyngeal membrane, and then later cloacal membrane also is broken, and we can see complete digestive tube, which is composed of ectodermal and endodermal parts. And here we can see embryonic oral cavity. It's simply opening or pit inside the face of embryo, in the middle of the face of embryo, and it's called stomodome. So let's look how embryonic face is developed. Here we can see embryonic face, and here we can see strange appearance what we all had, and here we can see frontal prominence, and it's embryonic mouth or embryonic oral cavity. Here we can see maxillary arcs and mandibular arcs which surround embryonic mouth. And here we can see embryonic oral cavity. It's unbroken oropharyngeal membrane and its place where this oropharyngeal membrane was broken. And here we can see communication between ectoderm and endoderm. And on the next stage of development, we can see here stomodome, embryonic mouth. It's a frontonasal prominence or frontonasal process. Also, we have maxillary process on two sides. It's paired process, and mandibular process, which also is paired, unpaired frontonasal process, and two paired maxillary and mandibulary processes from two sides from near the stomodome, embryonic oral cavity. So it's quite strange appearance of our face on early stage of embryonic development. What will happen next? This frontonasal prominence or frontonasal process is divided into three. It has frontal part, medial nasal, and lateral nasal process. Here you can see medial nasal process and lateral nasal process. It's maxillary process and mandibular process on two sides. Medial nasal process is paired as well as lateral nasal process, and its maxillary process it's also paired, and mandibular process is paired also. And let's look at development of mandibular process. The first one, And we can see here the development of Meckel's cartilage. Here we can see this cartilage. It forms the base of mandibula. It will be mandibula of the embryo. Here we can see mandibular process. It's paired, and we have two processes from two sides, and they are fused here. It's place of their fusion, and they are attached to each other, and they form mandibula. And in some cases, here we can see formed mandibula, and in some cases, this fusion is incomplete. It's normal condition, and some people they have pit in this region. It's normal condition. But in some cases, this process has some problems and it's incomplete. And here we can see cleft of lower lip and cleft of chin and cleft of mandibula, and its pathological condition. It's mistake of embryogenesis, mistake of fusion of mandibular processes from two sides. Next process, it's medial nasal process. It's paired and it's located on two sides of the face of embryo, and we can see it on two sides. Later, two medial nasal processes, they are coming together and they form common medial nasal process. And in normal condition, we have here depression which is called philtrum above upper lip. It's place of embryonic fusion where two medial nasal processes were fused. But in some cases we have mistake. There is a mistake of this fusion. It's medial cleft of the upper lip. It's mistake of the fusion of medial nasal processes. Next, medial nasal process. This one is shown in yellow. Is fused with maxillary process in this region on two sides, and there are two places of fusion where two processes are attached to each other. Here we can see midline, and on two sides we have two places of fusion. And here we can see mistakes of this fusion. It may be on one side, on two sides sometimes, and it's mistake of fusion of medial nasal process with maxillary process, and in normal conditions they should be attached completely during the embryogenesis. And lateral nasal process also is fused with maxillary process, and it's lying between inner corner of eye and nose. And in this region, nasolacrimal duct develops. Here it's place of fusion of medial nasal process with maxillary process. And in some cases also mistake of this fusion may occur, and it causes formation of oblique cleft of face, and it's mistake of embryogenesis in this region. So here we can see distribution of different regions on our face, and those regions they have different sources of their development. It's frontal process and place what develops from this frontal process. It's medial nasal process. It's a region of philtrum. Lateral sides of nose they develop from lateral nasal process. Maxillary process, it corresponds to upper part of our cheeks, and mandibular process, it corresponds to lower lip and chin and lower part of the cheeks. There are regions of our face which have different sources of development. And here we can see that maxillary process and mandibular process, they also are fused. Embryonic mouth is very wide, and angles they are located on two sides of our face in embryonic period. And on early stages of embryonic period, maxillary process and mandibular processes are fused. And here we can see region of the fusion. It's intermediate zone of cheek, And in our mouth, we can find a fold of mucosa. This fold corresponds to a region of teeth occlusion, and here we can see this fold. It's transitional zone of cheek. And in some cases, this fusion, this attachment of maxillary process to mandibular process is incomplete, and we call this condition macrostomia, when mouth is very wide. And in some cases, there is another condition which is called microstomia. It's when uh, we have two big extra attachment of maxillary process and mandibular process. In those cases, mouth opening is very small and it's called microstomy. So there are different mistakes of embryogenesis and different clefts, different gaps in the face, and they occur as a result of different mistakes of embryogenesis when different germs, different sources weren't fused with corresponding processes of the embryonic phase. And another question is development of palate. Palate separates oral and nasal cavity. Here we can see oral cavity and nasal cavity. And we can see that nasal process, it gives rise to the primary palate. It's a process which begins its growth from the nasal process, and it grows inside the oral cavity. It has triangle shape, and it may be found here. And also we have palating processes of the maxillary process. It gives rise to them, and they form secondary palate. So we have primary palate, it's shown in yellow. It grows from the nasal process, and also we have secondary palate, which begins its growth from the maxillary process. And also we have there are possible mistakes of embryogenesis. And first of all, it's cleft palate when processes weren't fused on the midline. It's first mistake of embryogenesis. And another mistake, it's so-called Gothic palate. It's very high and it has shape which reminds us of Gothic architecture. That's why it was called Gothic palate. It's also a mistake of the development of palate on early stages of embryogenesis. So we have discussed embryogenesis of the oral cavity and face, and we can see that different mistakes of embryogenesis may cause different clefts in the oral and facial structures.